Japan's war crimes trials after World War II, justice, controversy, and the quest for truth. When the dust of World War II finally settled in the Pacific, Japan's sudden surrender in August 1945 ushered in not only an Allied occupation but also a reckoning with the atrocities committed throughout Asia. The most prominent mechanism for this reckoning was the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, IMTFE, commonly referred to as the Tokyo Trials. Modeled in part after the Nuremberg trials in Europe, the Tokyo Tribunal aimed to hold high-ranking Japanese officials accountable for waging aggressive war and for sanctioning crimes against humanity. Yet from its inception in May 1946 to its concluding verdicts in November 1948, the Tokyo trials were fraught with legal complexities and political compromises. While some orchestrators of the war faced justice, key figures, especially Emperor Hirohito, escaped the defendant's dock, and certain units like the infamous Unit 731 avoided deep scrutiny altogether. Decades later, historians continue to debate whether these trials delivered genuine justice or a form of victor's justice, shaped by Allied strategic interests. The tribunal comprised judges and prosecutors from 11 nations, including the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, China, Australia, and others. 28 Japanese defendants, former politicians, generals, admirals, and diplomats, were indicted on charges of Class A crimes, meaning they were accused of plotting and initiating aggressive warfare. Unlike the European theater, where the Holocaust offered a stark demonstration of genocide, the Pacific War featured a different landscape of atrocities: the rape of Nanjing, forced labor, comfort women, and power mistreatment. These crimes formed the backdrop of the Tokyo trials, but the prosecution's central argument pivoted on the idea of Japan's overall conspiracy to wage a war of aggression, violating international treaties and covenants like the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Paralleling Nuremberg's concept of waging an illegal war, the proceedings sought to establish a chain of command that led from policy decisions in Tokyo to the brutalities inflicted across Asia. One glaring omission was Emperor Hirohito himself. Despite Western clamor over his role as nominal head of state and the spiritual figure at the war's center, Allied authorities, particularly US General Douglas MacArthur, concluded that prosecuting the emperor would destabilize the Japanese occupation. Washington's agenda hinged on quickly rebuilding Japan as a democratic bulwark against Soviet influence in Asia. Thus, Hirohito and any direct mention of his wartime responsibility was systematically shielded. This decision outraged many Chinese and other Asian communities, who viewed it as a whitewashing of the empire's highest authority. Historians note that removing the emperor from scrutiny allowed the Allies to direct blame onto generals and admirals while preserving Japan's imperial structure as a stabilizing symbol. During the trials, evidence emerged of atrocities ranging from Unit 731's grisly human experiments to the Bataan Death March. POWs took the stand, recounting forced labor, starvation, and rampant executions. Survivors of the rape of Nanjing testified about mass rapes and mass killings. However, the court was hampered by limitations, logistical, political, and legal. For instance, the Soviet Union, newly at odds with the West, had its own perspective on Japan's aggression, emphasizing events like the Kwantung Army's expansion in Manchuria. Allied prosecutors had to mesh differing interpretations of international law with disparate national agendas. Thus, while the trial did produce a voluminous record of wartime crimes, the global power shifts of the nascent Cold War shaped its contours in significant ways. The verdicts arrived in 1948. Out of the 28 defendants, 7 were sentenced to death, including Hideki Tojo, the former prime minister. 16 received life imprisonment, and 2 died during the trial. Some others received lesser sentences or were acquitted. The hangings of Tojo and other major figures occurred in late December 1948, just as the world turned its attention to rebuilding shattered nations and containing communism. Yet not all criminals faced the bench. Shiro Ishii of Unit 731, for instance, brokered an immunity deal with the US to hand over data on germ warfare, thus eluding trial altogether. Furthermore, many mid-level officers who oversaw local atrocities slipped through the cracks, returning to civilian life or occupying lower-profile posts in Japan's bureaucracy. Critiques of the Tokyo trials often focus on the notion of victor's justice. They argue that while Japan undeniably committed aggression, the tribunal did not equally scrutinize the Allies' wartime conduct, such as the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki or the firebombing of Tokyo, which killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The Allies defended those bombings as military necessities aimed at ending the war swiftly, leaving no seat at the table for reciprocal judgment. Moreover, Japanese nationalists, in later years, seized upon these perceived double standards to cast doubt on the tribunal's legitimacy, fueling a revisionist movement that claims the war aimed to liberate Asia from Western colonialism. Meanwhile, many victims in occupied countries viewed the trials as too lenient, especially when confronted with the knowledge that major perpetrators escaped indictment or received short sentences. On the other hand, defenders of the Tokyo trials maintain that the process established important precedents. It affirmed that individuals, including heads of government, could be held accountable for planning and conducting aggressive war. This principle, embryonic in the League of Nations era, found concrete legal expression through these trials. Furthermore, the trials documented in excruciating detail Japan's destructive campaigns across Asia, generating archives of testimonies and exhibits that still serve as a vital historical record. Even if incomplete, these proceedings contributed to post-war legal frameworks dealing with crimes against humanity and laid a foundation for subsequent tribunals, decades later, such as those for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda. The influence of the Tokyo trials on Japan's post-war society was complex. On one hand, they fed into the official narrative that a small group of militarists hijacked the nation, relieving the emperor and much of the populace from deep moral introspection. On the other, they crystallized a sense of war guilt in some Japanese intellectual circles, spurring movements for pacifism, including the adoption of Article 9 in Japan's new constitution, renouncing the right to wage war. Shifts in education policy saw the trials discussed in textbooks, albeit sometimes in muted tones. Over the decades, conservative voices tried to minimize the trial's conclusions, while progressive ones pointed to them as evidence that Japan must fully acknowledge its wartime wrongdoing. This tension remains a feature of Japan's political discourse. Curricular controversies about comfort women, Nanjing, and the nature of class or war criminals are regular flashpoints in Japanese domestic politics and diplomacy with neighbors like China and South Korea. In contemporary Asia, the legacy of the Tokyo trials resonates whenever officials visit Yasukuni Shrine, where some convicted war criminals are enshrined. China and Korea often protest these visits as glorifications of men found guilty by the tribunal. Diplomatic rows flare over statements by Japanese politicians who question the fairness of the trials or the veracity of certain atrocities. In this sense, the Tokyo trials cast a long shadow, shaping how historical memory intersects with modern geopolitics. While many remain grateful that at least some leaders answered for their actions, others feel the incomplete scope of justice, especially the shield given to Emperor Hirohito and immunity deals for groups like Unit 731, undermined the tribunal's moral authority. Ultimately, Japan's war crimes trials after World War II symbolize a crucial yet imperfect step in the global move toward defining and punishing crimes against peace and humanity. They reflect how powerful nations use legal frameworks to shape post-war orders and pursue political stability. Beyond the legal verdicts, the trials preserved first-hand accounts that endure as reminders of a conflict that uprooted tens of millions of lives. Historians continue to sift through trial transcripts and testimonies, gleaning insights into decision-making in Tokyo, military strategies, and the real human toll on the ground in places like Manchuria, Bhutan, or Nanjing. For all its flaws, the IMTFE opened a window on the moral and legal dimensions of a war that spanned continents. Subscribe to Legends of the Battlefield for more stories of brilliant tactics and legendary leaders.